By the fall of 1862, Confederate armies had marched into both Kentucky and Maryland, and, although turned back in each case, remained intact and dangerous. President Abraham Lincoln needed a clear Union victory before Northern public confidence collapsed entirely. Major General Ambrose Burnside, who had built a reputation for independent command with earlier successes along the North Carolina coast, was given command of the Army of the Potomac that November, a job he accepted only reluctantly. Burnside devised an ambitious plan: cross the Rappahannock River at Fredericksburg, outflank Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, and strike for Richmond before the Confederates could regroup. The scheme depended entirely on speed and surprise, but logistics turned against him almost immediately when the pontoon bridges needed to cross the river arrived late. Lee, recognizing that the Union held a numerical advantage at Fredericksburg, chose not to commit his whole army to defending the town itself and instead pulled back to the high ground west of it, fortifying the heights while the slow Union advance bought him valuable time. Burnside organized his roughly 120,000-man Army of the Potomac, 114,000 of whom would see action, into 3 grand divisions, plus a reserve: the right under Edwin Sumner, the center under Joseph Hooker, the left under William Franklin, and the reserve under Franz Sigel. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, nearly 79,000 strong with about 72,500 engaged, deployed James Longstreet's 1st Corps on and around the ridge known as Marie's Heights west of town, while Thomas Stonewall Jackson's 2nd Corps, arriving on November 29th, took up positions south of Fredericksburg to block any downstream crossing. Lee's reserve artillery answered to William Pendleton and his cavalry to J.E.B. Stuart. Believing correctly that Lee had thinned his center and left to reinforce his right, Burnside decided to cross directly at Fredericksburg itself. On December 11th, Union engineers began laying pontoon bridges into the town but came under heavy sniper fire from Confederates hidden among the buildings across the river. Union artillery bombarded the town in response, doing little to the entrenched Confederates but wrecking much of the town's infrastructure. At 3 that afternoon, 135 Union infantrymen from the 7th Michigan and 19th Massachusetts, crossed by boat under covering fire, cleared the Confederate skirmishers and opened the way for more troops to follow. Rather than retreat and regroup with Lee's main force, the outnumbered Confederate defenders chose to fight it out street by street, the first major urban combat in American history, until sheer Union numbers finally pushed them out and the town fell. 4 Union brigades occupied Fredericksburg that evening and, despite direct orders not to, looted it with a viciousness unlike anything seen earlier in the war, enraging Lee, infuriating Confederate soldiers, many of them native Virginians, and shocking even some Union men. Franklin's crossing south of town went far more smoothly, and by December 12th, most of the Army of the Potomac had crossed the river and begun preparing its assault on Lee's fortified lines. The Union plan for December 13th called for Sumner's Right Grand Division to launch a diversionary assault on Longstreet's position at Marie's Heights, while Franklin's Left Grand Division rolled up Jackson's line on the Confederate left. That morning, Franklin ordered his 1st Corps commander, John Reynolds, to select a division for the attack. Reynolds chose his smallest, roughly 4,500 men under George Meade, with John Gibbon's division assigned to support him. As the Union troops advanced, a single Confederate gun under Major John Pelham pushed forward ahead of the main line, opened fire and brought the entire advance to a halt. Told he was free to withdraw from such an exposed position, the 24-year-old Pelham reportedly replied that he could hold his ground, and Lee himself, watching from a distance, praised the courage of one so young, the origin of the nickname the Gallant Pelham that stuck with him afterward. His lone gun delayed an entire Union corps for roughly an hour and exposed the Union's plan well ahead of time, withdrawing only once his ammunition finally ran out. Reynolds then ordered an artillery bombardment of Jackson's position under Colonel Charles Wainwright, while Jackson held his men back to await the coming infantry assault. After an hour of shelling that had done far less damage than the Union believed, Meade's and Gibbon's divisions, roughly 6,000 men combined, pushed forward, only to be stopped in their tracks once Confederate artillery opened with its full weight. Around 1 o'clock, Meade's renewed advance found an undefended gap in the Confederate line running through boggy ground the Confederates had assumed was impassable. He pushed part of his force through the gap, while the rest kept the nearby Confederates occupied as a distraction, and for a brief window his men tore into the unprepared defenders behind the line, inflicting real damage. But the breakthrough force had no support, and once Jackson committed his reserves, they were quickly thrown back. A Confederate counterattack led by James Lane and Edward Thomas then struck Gibbon's equally unsupported division and drove it back as well. Most of the Union troops on this flank retreated to their starting line rather than press the advantage further. Jackson pulled his men back into their original positions, half expecting a renewed Union assault that never came, and as evening fell, the fighting on the Confederate left quietly petered out. That same morning, Sumner received his orders to assault Marye's Heights and sent Darius Couch's Second Corps forward, with William French's 3 brigades leading the way. Confederate artillery, firing down from the elevated heights, tore into the advancing Union lines with devastating effect, halting the assault and inflicting severe casualties before French's men could even reach the Confederate position. Couch fed brigade after brigade into the attack over the following 2 hours, each meeting the same fate as the one before. Union dead piled up so thickly that fresh troops had to climb over their own fallen comrades just to keep advancing. Despite the mounting slaughter, Burnside kept pouring men into the assault, determined to maintain pressure on the heights. Colonel Rush Hawkins led the day's final attack late in the afternoon, and it failed just as completely as the rest. By nightfall, roughly 7,500 Union soldiers had been killed or wounded at Marye's Heights alone, against barely 1,000 Confederate casualties, one of the most lopsided butcher's bills of the entire war. As the fighting died down, the cries of wounded men trapped between the lines began to carry across the field. Confederate Sergeant Richard Rowland Kirkland, unable to bear the sound any longer, gathered an armful of canteens and walked out into the open, without a flag of truce or any ceasefire, to bring water to wounded Union soldiers lying in no man's land. Union troops, recognizing what he was doing, held their fire, and Kirkland earned lasting fame as the Angel of Marye's Heights. In the days that followed, Burnside tried to shift blame for the disaster onto his subordinates, who insisted the failure was his alone. At a dinner on the evening of December 13th, an apparently desperate Burnside announced he would personally lead his old Ninth Corps in one more assault on the heights the next morning, but his generals talked him out of it. The final tally made plain just how lopsided the battle had been. The Union suffered 12,653 men killed or wounded in total, the great majority of them at Marye's Heights, against 5,377 Confederate casualties. Burnside asked Lee for a truce to recover his wounded, which Lee granted, and the following day Federal forces withdrew back across the Rappahannock, bringing the campaign to a close. News of the one-sided defeat stunned the North and deepened public doubts about Lincoln's handling of the war, doubts that lingered until Burnside himself was removed from command within weeks.